Laura Forczyk, welcome to the Astro Ben podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
No problem, no problem. Whereabouts are you? You're obviously in the States, but whereabouts?
Atlanta.
Oh, nice, nice. Oh, hang on. It was disabled due to... Are you still there, Laura?
I'm still here.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, what I was going to say, don't worry, we can edit this out. If the internet, there is a bit of lag, it records it both sides, so it doesn't need to, just carry on as if it was normal. So I'll start again. Hi, Laura. Welcome to the Astro Ben podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Well, look, I really wanted to speak to you because I've recently been getting back into Twitter and following a load of awesome space people to try and connect with new people in the industry. And you're quite prolific on Twitter, which is where I first became aware of you. Do you use Twitter as a tool for interacting with the community? How do you find Twitter, just as a starting point?
Yeah, exactly that. So I find that especially in today's age where we are very isolated, I haven't been traveling much over the past 2 years, as many people haven't. And I find it very helpful to connect online to communities that I really feel engaged with. And Twitter, especially, is one of those communities where the space community, the space circles are really very active. And I love following different people, journalists, experts in the field, and even just amateurs who are interested in hearing what their perspectives are. And it's really fun to have that interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the sort of space Twitter community is very much a niche that I'm kind of on the periphery of because I don't get too involved in conversations about certain things, but I like to kind of, it's certainly a good way of keeping up to date with who's who in the industry. But yeah, thank you for coming on. So let's start with your background and career. Perhaps you could give us a kind of very brief overview of how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I've always loved space, as probably most of your listeners have as well. And so when I was a student in high school trying to figure out what to do, I decided to pursue astrophysics because I fell in love with the great imagery from Hubble and, really trying to figure out how the universe was formed and what is out there and what are all these really beautiful things that we capture with our space observatories. So I majored in astrophysics first, and then I went on to switch over to planetary science because I worked in a lab in graduate school that had really hands-on what I call experimental planetary science, looking at the regolith, the dirt and dust and other things on the moon especially, but also Mars and asteroids. And myself, I've always wanted to be an astronaut, and going to the moon was the very first thing that I remember writing about when I was 9 years old. For me, I've always loved the idea of going to the moon. And so what more fun is it than to play with fake moon dirt, which is what I did in grad school. and then from there, I got a job working on International Space Station payloads. So looking at all of the different possibilities and all the proposals and the scientists and engineers who want to work with space station, especially on the physical sciences side, because that's my background. But we were such a small team that I also helped out on the biological sciences side too, the life sciences. And so it was really diverse in all the things, all the microgravity experiments, the human experiments for astronauts, even using ISS as a platform for Earth observation or astronomy. And so all the different types of ways that you can use the space environment, I got completely immersed in it. And then from there, I got hired on by a international startup that, one of the things about startups, especially in space, where it's very capital intensive, is that startups don't always work out. So this startup in particular had the idea of doing what's called point-to-point suborbital transportation, where they wanted to build a suborbital spacecraft and do human transportation around the globe to different spaceports. Did not work out. They went bankrupt. And from there, I started my own company about 6 years ago, Astralytical. And we do space science, space industry, and space policy analysis and project support. And it's just been a blast. It was a really strong learning curve for me because I have no business background at all. So trying to become what I call an accidental entrepreneur, where I was learning business on the fly. I'm still learning so much, on the sales side side or on the marketing side, all this stuff that does not come naturally to me because I'm a scientist. I think differently. So really over the past 6 years, learning how to run my own company, learning how to, how to expand, how to scale, how to hire people and all that kind of thing. But I'm really excited about where I am right now. I just published my second book this month, so I'm very, very excited about that. So yeah, you have specific questions, I'm sure, but that's briefly how I got to where I am.
That's so awesome. Well, I think it was probably a good experience for you that you experienced what a startup can end up like. Because I don't know what the stats are, but a high percentage of startups don't work. I've been through bankruptcy once myself, and it's kind of it kind of comes with the territory, really. So you probably absorbed a lot having gone through that experience. But I think no one really knows what they're doing when they set up a company. But everything you're doing is kind of, you're doing the right things. I Googled your name and, you're constantly commenting, and, giving quotes to various press articles, a really good source for journalists, about the subject matter. So you're sort of pushing yourself out there. Perhaps tell us about Astralytical, because that's obviously the company that you've started. You've been doing for about 6 years now. How did that come about? Was it, was it because that's, the sort of what you're doing with the consulting, you're sort of looking at data and advising companies to make decisions through data? How did Astralytical come about as a company name? And, were you really sort of an accidental entrepreneur, or had you sort of been thinking about it for a while?
No, I hadn't been thinking about it for a while. I was really engaged in the company I was working for, but it was quite clear that they were going south and that the company was not going to recover. So for about, 4 or 5 months before the company officially dissolved, my immediate boss was pretty much pushing me out the door, saying, "Find some other opportunities." He himself had, was looking for other opportunities as he was hoping the company would recover. And so I got to thinking, what can I do? And one of the key things was, at that time, I was pregnant with my first child, and I was actually clearing out the office at Kennedy Space Center about a couple of weeks before my first child was born. And so, like, what do I do as a brand new mother, with new bankruptcy, like new unemployment here? What do I do? And so I decided to ease my way into consulting. And I talked to a lot of my colleagues who had experience consulting in one way or another. And a lot of the pushback I got was that I was too young. A lot of consultants are at the end of their careers, semi-retired or very senior. And I, at that time, I had significant working experience, but not senior level, and so, I'm like, I might as well try, right? I was living in Central Florida at the time, Space Coast, and, surrounded by a great community there. And I'm not the kind of person to just sit at home. That's not me. So I planned for Astralytical. I didn't exactly know what direction to go in, but I had previously worked part-time for another company that doesn't really exist anymore, doing space consulting and analysis of the industry. And so even though I don't have that kind of background in my formal education, I had still gotten that experience of what does it take to analyze the space markets and the industry and the economy, and diving into business plans and that kind of stuff. And so I'm like, well, I can go in that direction, but I also have the strong academic background. So I was talking to my colleagues at universities, trying to figure out what kind of research projects or proposals I can get involved with. And from there, that first year was really tough, I'll be honest. And you asked me how the name came about. Astralytical is astronomy and analytical just combined together, right? So that's where I saw the company is just analyzing the space sector in one way or another. And I wanted to keep it broad too, because I'm not the kind of person who can specialize deep deep in a field for very long. Like I'll do deep dives in a subject, but then I need to move on to a different subject. And that's what's really great about my company is the diversity of projects I get to work in, the really great ways that I can learn all these different areas and keep myself learning and keep interacting with different types of people all around the world. Because I work with small and large companies, especially startups. They're my biggest segment of clients is startup companies, government entities, and not just US government, but around the world. Educational institutions, nonprofits. I mean, I work with so many different types of people. It's really fun. But that first year was so tough because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't really have a clear direction for the company. But especially that second year, I found my wind, and it's just been growing from there. And I'm not saying that the company is exactly where I want it to be, but last year, 2021, was the best year of my company's existence. And so I'm really on a high that I can make 2022 just as good, if not better.
Oh, amazing. Congrats. Well, I guess, whilst the rest of the world has been sort of, struggling with the dreaded C word, the space industry is exploding and there's more and more startups. A lot of people are focusing on it. So I think, people are. Do you think you mentioned most of your clients are sort of startups? Is that the stage that they come to you? So they're in their first year or two and they've identified a skills gap, or they, want something a bit more rigorous than a couple of visuals to show to investors. Who are the startups that come to you? Do they just have a crazy idea? Do they have a white paper? What do they come to you to do?
So it really depends. Sometimes they are in the pre-formation stage where they have an idea and they need help actually starting the company, actually creating that backbone of how a company starts. Sometimes they're a few years in and they need help growing, or they want to grow in a specific area and they want to understand the market in that area. And so it really just depends on where the company is and what their needs are. So it might be that they need help figuring out the market in, the United States for small launchers or for microgravity payloads around the world, or what is that user base, here or there? Like, how do they expand through what's called ITAR here in the United States? That's a real bane of existence for a lot of international companies. There's all kinds of things that companies need help understanding. And that's where I can come in, is to really help them direct, where they want to go, how to get there, or identify different markets, different segments that they hadn't thought of. Help them to connect with either individuals at other companies or trade associations or whoever it is that they need to connect with to help their business grow. And another segment of what Astralytical does is space career coaching. And so sometimes, it's not very common, but sometimes somebody will come to me who wants to start a space business and they want career coaching instead of the consulting part. So that is helping them figure out, okay, what are your goals in your career that you want to start this company? So it's really dependent on where that person is in their moment and what their motivations are, what their goals are, and how can I help them get to where they want to be.
And I guess because you've got a scientific academic background, that sort of sets you apart from other, consultants that have just gone to Harvard and got an MBA in business. I'm currently doing an MBA myself, and I did have a sort of data and analytics module, and I definitely have a new appreciation for data analysts, because knowing the right questions to ask of data is just something that is worth its weight in gold. So I can imagine, for startups and for governments and all sorts of companies, having someone that is smart and can sort of pull together an idea and make it make sense is invaluable.
One of the things I love about data is that it can be read in so many different ways. So somebody might be collecting data for one reason, and I can take a look at it and see different patterns or different ways to apply it. And that is one of my favorite things to do, actually. We also in Astralytical write reports, and that's some of the things that we do is we take existing data out there that's for some other purpose, and we analyze it, and we put it out there saying this is what this can tell us, that nobody else is saying that this data is, they're not even thinking about using this data in this way, but here's another way that you can use this data to help you, whatever it is that we find in that data. It is really cool. I didn't think I'd go in that direction, but it makes sense as a scientist that I can pour through information, and because I'm not stuck in one field or one sub tiny little field like most scientists tend to be, I see connections all over the place that other people might not see, and that's one of my great strengths, as well as a weakness, is that I don't stick to one thing. I look at all the different fields, all the different disciplines. So interdisciplinary, mindset is really helpful for me to look at data and see it in different ways.
That's so cool. So you mentioned your new book, I believe is your second book. It's called Off-Worldly, Becoming Off-Worldly even. Tell us about it. I mean, it's a little bit, you can tell from the title what it's about, but what is it? What is it? How do you become off-worldly?
Yeah, so as of this recording, it comes out in a week officially. And I'm so excited to get this out there, because this is a book that I write the books that I wish other people had written, and there's no other book out there quite like this, where I interviewed 17 experienced flown astronauts from around the world. So a large part of them are NASA astronauts, but there's also ESA, Korea, Japan. So I asked them what surprised them about their spaceflight experiences, and got so many diverse answers. But I was able to categorize those answers into themes. So, for example, the first big chapter is launch, and you might think, well, of course, when we see launches, they're very loud, they're very violent, it's a sensory experience. Yeah, but you and I haven't been inside a rocket, so there's no way to simulate launch. And I myself have gone through different simulations. I've gone through centrifuge training. I've gone through those videos where you try to, you simulate it that way, but there's no substitute to actually being in a rocket. And so just hearing those astronaut experiences and what helped them to prepare is invaluable. Second, I don't remember the order of chapters right now, but like looking at the Earth from above. So the person who wrote the foreword for my book, Frank White, he's well known for writing a book called The Overview Effect. And so I knew the overview effect would come up. That's how you see the world differently after you've been in space and see it as a global entity, a planet, a system that unites us all. But there's still no way to really prepare for that. And so that's my longest chapter, is the different ways that astronauts got surprised, shocked. Even though they had expected the overview effect, it still surprised them in the ways they saw the world. Different ways that astronauts, microgravity, the ways that it affected them, both positive and negative. So some people really love sleeping in microgravity, for example, and then some do not. And the ways you get sick in microgravity, or the ways that you have to readjust back to 1G. So all of these great experiences is about the first 2/3 of the book, I'd say. The last third is interviews I did with future flyers. And so I interviewed 14 future flyers, and 4 of them actually ended up flying before my book was published, which is really exciting to see. And so getting an idea from them, those early pioneers. I'm sorry, I'll have to edit this out.
It's okay, don't worry.
So getting an idea from those early pioneers, what they're doing to prepare for space holistically. So that's not just the physical preparation that we hear about, emotional preparation, mental preparation, even spiritual preparation. Like, what are they doing to prepare themselves to go fly to space? And this isn't theoretical, it's actually happening. So Wally Funk, for example, was one of my earlier interviewees. So back in 2020, I interviewed her, and she had already booked a flight, but she didn't know when she was going to fly. And then she flew on first flight of Blue Origin that was human carrying. And so I got to interview her before and after her flight to get an idea of both of her ways of preparing And if you don't know Wally Funk, her story is amazing.
Yeah.
So I write about her in the book too, how, where she got to, with the 60 years of essentially of preparing for her space flight, and then how she felt after her space flight. So, those kinds of perspectives of people like you and me, or people, it's not just billionaires also. That's something I wanted to emphasize. I have a whole chapter in there about science because I'm a scientist, and I've been involved in what's called the suborbital researcher community, where scientists really want to be able to conduct their science in space using a human in the loop system. So not automating it all, which is what we've had to do till this point. But now we're going to have, scientists doing their own science experiments in space. That doesn't need to be a government astronaut, right? It could be any scientist from a university, from really anywhere. And that's really exciting to see. So we saw that for the first time last year with Virgin Galactic. There was one of the Virgin Galactic employees, Suresh Bandla, who flew the first human-tended suborbital science experiment ever. So really also changing that mindset that it's all just a billionaire joyride, because there's real science that can be done on these flights. And so it's the whole book is a real guide to thinking about spaceflight differently and thinking about it personally. How can you personally prepare? What surprised astronauts that maybe you can think differently about as you're preparing for your future spaceflight? And it's for people like you and me who want to fly someday. I mean, I don't know, I'm speaking for you here, but I personally want to fly someday, right? So I don't have the billions, but it's changing. It's changing slowly, but in a way it's changing quickly too. So we've been waiting for so long for this new era of human spaceflight. And that's what the book is about, is really helping people to make that transition in their minds of thinking this is for someone else, this is for government entities or for billionaires, to really thinking about, hey, this is for me. And what would I do if I went to space, and how can I prepare to go to space?
That sounds so interesting. I'll definitely be reading it. I'll put notes at the end of this podcast on how to pre-order and order a copy. But I think, going to space is something that, was so, like 50 years ago, it was only for a very small, very tiny niche of the most elite test pilots, mainly US centric. But I think, as you say, the commercialization of space and, space, the advent of space tourism is really sort of making it a real possibility. But you don't really know, if we are, and by the way, I definitely really want to go to space. But you don't really know how it's going to affect you until you actually do it. You could do all the training. I had Chris Boshuizen on the podcast a few episodes ago, and he told me about, he didn't actually experience the overview effect, which he'd heard a lot about, and he coined a new phrase, the outer view effect, because for him to look out into space, it sort of ignited a desire to explore, which he'd never really had before, which I think is super interesting. So it affects different people in different ways. I'm not asking you to name, but if you could go on a SpaceX or Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin or other launch capabilities are nearly available, which would be the one for you? Like, do you, having seen the amount of firsts last year, what experience sort of resonates with you the most? I mean,
well, I'll take anything first off. So if someone's hearing this, they want to sponsor my trip, I'll go. But I'm a lunatic, right? I want to go to the moon. So whether that's with a SpaceX Starship or Blue Origin Blue Moon or whoever it is that's going to end up on the moon, like that's me. Send me to the moon. I'll stay there for a couple of weeks, do, some awesome science, get a different perspective. Because again, it's about becoming off-worldly, right? So
of course,
just Earth orbit, that's everywhere that we go off planet, and that magnificent desolation, as astronaut Buzz Aldrin called it, like I want to see that firsthand. I want to experience that. So that's where I would go, is the moon. And I know a lot of people want to go to Mars. They can go to Mars. Elon can go to Mars. That's fine.
Yeah.
But
no,
right there.
I'm with you, and it's kind of, it doesn't seem so far away. Like you can kind of, you can reach Earth still, so you don't feel too homesick. And yeah, well, I think that is going to be a possibility in our lifetime. So, can't wait for that. Going back to Twitter again, you identify as a feminist on social media. Has that always been an important part of your identity. And I wonder how being a feminist has affected your career to date in the science world.
That's interesting. No one's asked me that in an interview before. So I was raised by feminists, and I find that very important. So my grandmother, she was she worked in an era where women didn't usually work. My mother, she was also a small business owner. She's a lawyer, so different type of field. But she inspired me as a young person watching her run her own law firm, and it was just ingrained in me that I can do anything I put my mind to, and that it just did not matter what my gender was. And taking that a step further, I think it's very important that people don't limit themselves no matter what gender they identify with. So, it's not just binary, right? And so one of the things that I want to help, actually the last chapter of the book, going back to the book, is talking about inclusivity, and not just inclusivity in terms of gender, but inclusivity in terms of geographic backgrounds and disabilities. So I've got 2 children that are disabled. And so just thinking about the ways that we limit people. And why are we limiting people based on their gender? Why are we limiting people based on their race or their ethnicity or their able-bodiedness, whether or not it's a hidden disability or a visible disability? So I think it's important that we take all these biases in mind, especially as, I've gone through my career being in some ways very, not often, but in very obvious ways discriminated against because I'm a woman. That didn't really start until after I got out of school and into my career. And I began to see the ways that people treated me differently. And especially when I became a mother, and how people then assume that I will do something differently or stop working or whatever it is because I'm a mother. And it's just one of those things. Well, do you think about fathers that way? Why are we limiting certain people? And to what effect? I especially before I got married, when I was single and in grad school or starting my career, there were a lot of men in power who felt like they could pursue me because they were men in power. And it was one of those things like, how can I work for somebody? There was one job in particular. I was really applying for a job at this one particular employer that I absolutely had fallen in love with the job, the whole mission, but the CEO kept making inappropriate advances. I'm like, well, how can I work with you when you don't take me seriously as a professional? You see me as a young woman. You don't see me as a professional. So how can I work for someone like that, right? So in some ways, it has diverted my career in other directions because I had to stop pursuing certain avenues because of certain people who saw me in a way that was not appropriate. And so it's one of those things where we have to, I've got my personal experience, but we have to see how we are treating other people. Are we treating other people, putting them in a specific box or limiting them in some way or not inviting them to the table because we see them differently because of our own biases? And so that is something that I need to work through. And I thank my kids for helping to show me how ableism has affected me and the way that I see people with disabilities, whatever the disability is. And I'm still working through all that, right? And we all have our biases. So we all have to look to see, where are we limiting other people? Where are we limiting ourselves even? And work through that to make sure that we have an inclusive community. Because if we want to go out into space, if we have this ideal Star Trek vision, which I do in a sense, of going out into space and putting our best foot forward, but we're still human, right? We still have those biases. So making sure that we work through that so we can become a better version of humanity as we go forward, which is really super idealistic and not realistic at all. I understand. But it's still the way that I think, where I hope that we improve as a humanity as we progress technologically.
Yeah, I share that sort of aspiration. I think if human spaceflight does become a thing, which I think we both agree it will, to carry the light of human consciousness out amongst the stars, it has to carry the best of humanity and, a diverse and equitable representation of humanity. And the space industry in particular, I think, hasn't seen a transformation yet, but it's vastly improved from the Apollo era in terms of, an equitable opportunity to be in the industry. What can people like me do to be more of an ally to women in the space industry? Because it's sometimes hard to enter the conversation. I mean, first of all, I'm not a woman, and also I'm not technically in the space industry, but I share the desire to make the industry more equitable.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas on that?
Speaking up does wonders. And so, for example, you talked about Twitter. Twitter is a very toxic place for women, especially women who have a larger following. And so sometimes I will actually go through just normal posts that my friends who are women who are more popular have a larger following than I, and I will just look to see how many sexist junk replies come from that, right? And maybe some of them are bots, but a lot of them are just people who have that kind of bias internally to them and feel that they need to express that because they don't get pushback. So they're not going to accept the pushback from the women that they're degrading. They might accept the pushback from the men, right? And so if you see that, say something. Or, if someone makes a comment to you in passing, even just a joke, usually jokes hide that kind of negativity, speak up, right? Because it's the peer pressure of saying, this is not appropriate. This language is not appropriate. This thought process is not appropriate. And also, noting where people are treating other people differently. So if a woman is being treated differently, go ahead and correct that, whether it's taking notes at a meeting because that seems to be delegated to women, right? Or not being invited to leadership positions or award nominations or whatever it is. It tends to be people are gravitated towards those who are like them. And so that might be your race, that might be your gender, that might be your ethnicity, it might be your educational background, whatever it is. But, if you notice that it's all white men that are being nominated to some leadership position or some award or some team, then maybe think, why are you only identifying white men? And it's not because there aren't any other people out there. Trust me, I've gotten that excuse. Oh, there are no other women. Yes, there are women out there. Yes, there are people of color out there. Yes, there are people who are different from you. You just don't know them because you haven't looked for them. And so just identifying those things, and that's for all of us, right? That's for me as well, is identifying where we are leaving people out and then inviting them in.
Absolutely. Well, I've certainly noticed that. I've gone to quite a few space conferences over the last 5 years, and you almost guaranteed in the plenary sessions, someone's going to ask the obvious question in the room, which is, why are all the people on stage, white and male? And I think, there is a bit of an improvement, but there's still a long way to go. But I think young people, which I class myself in that category, just about, are still demanding change, which I think is happening. You volunteer for a few different organisations, Beyond Earth, For All Moonkind, Cislunar Space Development Company, and you're a mentor at the Brooke Owens Fellowship. Now, a lot of people who I spoke to have said incredible things about the Brooke Owens Fellowship. What does it mean to you to be a part of that?
Yeah, I love this initiative, and I'm so grateful that the founders started it and that the executive directors and the people in leadership have continued it, because I think it's so important to give women and people like gender minorities a place where they feel they belong, invited. It's a continuation of the same theme, right? So when I was younger, when I was a student, there was nothing like that. There was I was part of a NASA internship called NASA Academy, which helped me find my people. In a sense, like I felt like I belonged there, but it was not a place of a sisterhood. It wasn't a place where I felt like that it's different sometimes when you're in a male dominated field, especially if you are the only woman in your classes, which is much more common in engineering. For me, coming from astrophysics, actually my classes were pretty much male and female parity. Especially in undergrad, a lot less so in grad school, but especially in engineering, where women are still about 20%, and it depends on what type of engineering, which field. But it's really important sometimes where you have that kind of standoutish, where you stand out in the crowd, and then you feel different. You feel like an outsider, to sometimes be surrounded like people like you. And that is something that I feel like the Brooke Owens Fellowship and other similar fellowships that have popped up since then have have the ability to do is to give people a place where they feel like they belong, especially when they're just entering a field. You know, students who are just trying to figure out, do they belong in this field? And I've known, I went to an undergrad with women who decided that they didn't feel like they fit in the field, and they left. They either left the workforce altogether, or, you know, one went to baking. Like they just did not feel like they fit. And especially if you're bombarded by sexism. I know other women who were young adults, you know, in their careers, who just got so much sexism thrown into them, they figured it's not worth it anymore, and they left the field. So sometimes you really need that support network to say, you do belong, and here's how we can support you as you're going through different challenges. And whether that's just challenges in classes, because, you know, especially as you get farther and farther along in your education, the classes get tougher and tougher. And sometimes there's that message from professors or from authority members that you don't belong because you're struggling. But that's not true. We all struggle, just some of us hide it better than others, right? And so having that support network to say you do belong, even though you're struggling, I think is really important. So I'm really grateful that I get to interact with the Brookies, and other students too. I mentor other students as well. And it's really rewarding, because I had people who helped me along the way as a student, as a young adult. And it's a way of giving back, to show them, I did it. You can do it too. Like, there's nothing particularly special about me that got me to where I am. It's just I persisted, and you can persist too.
Of course. Oh, I wish I could be a Brookie. But no, seriously, the value of mentorship is something that, you know, I don't think enough. Oh, I think people are aware of it, but, you know, I wouldn't be where I am today without some mentors I've had over the years. Well, look, you're certainly an inspiration to young people. I'll share details of you know, how to buy your second book, Becoming Off-Worldly. If people want to check out Astralytical, I will share the details on that as well. Just as a sort of final thought, on the podcast, I speak to entrepreneurs about their highs and lows on the entrepreneurial journey. What was the hardest part about starting Astralytical, and what advice would you give to young people today who perhaps are thinking of starting their own company in the space industry?
In December, I wrote a blog article actually identifying the hardest thing about starting Astralytical, which was that first year when I had two terrible clients in a row, and especially the second client, who made me think that maybe I should just dissolve the company altogether, give up, and find a full-time job, because it just was not working. I was miserable. It was a bad client. It was a bad relationship. And I didn't write about it in this article, but in previous articles, I've written about how I devalued myself, especially coming from an academic background. It's a challenge to move from a mindset where you give everything for free and you volunteer for everything, or you're paid, you know, almost minimum wage for tutoring, you know, to a mindset of my time is worth it. I am valuable. I should be charging what I am worth. And what am I worth? Well, reevaluating what your time is worth, what your expertise is worth, and asking for it. So those were some of the biggest challenges of getting through that first year, of figuring out what I wanted my company to do and what direction I wanted it to go in, to learning how to value myself, my time, my expertise, which is something I still struggle with to this day, honestly. And then also learning how to be pickier. I mean, it doesn't make sense in the beginning, that first year when I didn't have clients, to think about being picky, right? But that was the one thing that really made a difference, was really identifying who I work with, because it makes so much difference whether you're working full time for somebody else and you've got coworkers or bosses that are just toxic and you know you need to get away from them, or on the flip side, when you've got coworkers or bosses that are very inspirational and motivational and supportive, and that makes all the difference. It really does. So being pickier about who I worked with, because it made all the difference in how I felt about myself and my work and my company.
Fantastic. Laura, it's been great to chat to you. It's really been inspiring. I know my listeners would say the same. So thank you so much.
Thank you.